5 years ago at Brasilia in Brazil at the sidelines of a similar BRICS summit. This was a clear sign. This meeting was a clear sign of a thaw in relations that, if you recall, had gone into a deep freeze.
Agreement on disengagement.
Right.
It only talks of progress being made, whereas we have been talking about complete disengagement. So I think some of these discrepancies will need to be addressed, agreeing on some kind of package for disengagement. Not timing, one can speculate only that Chinese are also under a lot of pressure.
Right.
They're facing geopolitical pushback. They're going through economic difficulties. You would have noticed that there is a degree of tactical flexibility being displayed by China in its dealings with major countries.
Not only cautioning us and not getting overexcited as what is happening, not be using loose terms in terms of describing it as a breakthrough, a détente, or rapprochement, but to actually take it step by step, watch what they're doing, meanwhile learn how to manage China, with our eyes open, having learned our lessons from the past where we did misread some signs. But thank you very much. You've thrown a lot of light for it.
Thanks for inviting me. Really good to have this conversation with you.
Nothing but the truth. When Prime Minister Narendra Modi shook hands with Chinese President Xi Jinping at Kazan in Russia on October 23rd, the visuals spoke for themselves. The last time they had such an interaction was 5 years ago at Brasilia in Brazil at the sidelines of a similar BRICS summit. This was a clear sign. This meeting was a clear sign of a thaw in relations that, if you recall, had gone into a deep freeze after major intrusions by Chinese troops at the line of actual control in Ladakh in June 2020. The statements issued after the meeting by the respective foreign ministries from both countries had variations, but there was a broad consensus to resolve the outstanding border issues so that relations could be back on a track and possibly return to being what is called normal. So in this episode of Nothing But the Truth, we will analyze the promises and pitfalls of the significant development in India-China relations. To do that, we will be joined later by Ashok Kantha, a former Indian ambassador to China and also former director of the Institute of Chinese Studies in Delhi. But before I begin the discussion with Ambassador Ashok Kantha, a brief background to put things in perspective. It's a very complex issue. And let's look at the India-China dispute. This dispute originated from differing perceptions of the border set largely during the British rule of India and continued after independence. Now, the border dispute involves around 3,500 kilometers across India's northern borders, and both nations claim land on each side of what is known as the line of actual control. The borders, of course, let me add, is not just northern, but right across the eastern borders. If you look at a map of India, you could see it stretched right from Jammu and Kashmir side towards Arunachal Pradesh on the other side in the east. So it's a long border, 3,500 kilometers, and this border being disputed, and therefore there's been no agreement except that there has been what is known as the line of actual control, or LAC. And now the LAC is essentially a demarcation line separating Indian, what we call Indian administered side of the border and the Chinese administered territories over that side. And it has three primary sectors. This particular border dispute has three primary sectors based on geography and strategic significance. Now, let's look at each of these sectors so you'll get a sense of what follows. The first is the western sector, which is a very critical sector that includes Ladakh and what is now known as Aksai Chin, that spans 38,000 square kilometers. Now, Aksai Chin is a high altitude, vast desert that is largely uninhabitable, but strategically important to China. Now, after China annexed Tibet in 1950, I'm giving a bit of history in this, it gradually began to occupy the Aksai Chin area as it needed to connect Tibet with its western province of Xinjiang. And they wanted a direct route. So in the early 1950s, China began constructing a major highway called that time G219 through Aksai Chin to connect Tibet and Xinjiang. Now, this road was completed around 1957, and of course, this became a very critical logistical link, cementing China's strategic interests in the area. But the road was reportedly discovered by India only in 1958 formally, when patrolling Indian troops happened to come across it. And this, by the way, became one of the major reasons in the build-up for the 1962 India-China War. Now, India faced a humiliating defeat in that border conflict, and China used the war to ensure that its occupation of Aksai Chin was complete, and it fortified its claims over the territory. Meanwhile, the LAC, or line of actual control, on the Ladakh border continued to be a major point of dispute between the two countries and the source, as we saw, of recent conflicts. Today, Aksai Chin remains a flashpoint in India-China relations and continues to do so because India's infrastructure developments in Ladakh, aimed at countering Chinese advancements, have led to recurring tensions, as we saw in the Galwan Valley clash of 2020. Meanwhile, the China-Pakistan alliance has deepened through what is called the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or the CPEC, which passes close to the disputed areas that we're looking at. And this, of course, underscores the lasting impact of historical developments on Aksai Chin on regional geopolitics. Now, that's the western sector that I talked about. There is another sector called the second sector. The major sector which is disputed is called the middle sector. Now, this is roughly 2,000 square kilometers of territory bordering Himachal Pradesh and Uttarakhand. There have relatively been fewer disputes, and the LAC here is better demarcated, and the military deployment has not been that significant. So we'll move quickly to the third major area of border dispute between India and China, and this is known as the eastern sector at Arunachal Pradesh. Now, this consists of close to 90,000 square kilometers, which China calls it as South Tibet. Now, this claim stems from Arunachal Pradesh's cultural and historical association with Tibet, especially the border town of Thaw. This sector was also the focus of intense fighting during the 1962 war. Now, both sides patrol up to what they perceive as their LOC, or line of actual control, and there have been skirmishes off and on over the years in this particular sector too. So, while India-China relations nosedived after the India-China war, it was only in the 80s that the two sides, 1980s, 20 years, that the two sides decided to resume ties, which involved signing a series of agreements between the two countries to make the line of actual control, or LAC, the unofficial buffer till a final agreement was reached. Now, before the 2020 Galwan clash that happened, there were two major skirmishes between the two militaries. And when I'm talking, there were in between, of course, other skirmishes that were happening, border conflicts, but the two big ones that happened, very similar to the Galwan Valley, was one in 1967 at Nathula in Sikkim that resulted in troop casualties between the two countries, with India reportedly coming off the better in that particular clash. Remember, this is 5 years after the 1962 war with India and China, and here again we had a lot of casualties. Then the other big confrontation happened in 1987 in what is called the Sumdorong-Chu Valley. Now, I may not be pronouncing the way the Chinese do, and this is in Tawang, which I mentioned earlier, in Arunachal Pradesh. And this time, when India noticed that Chinese troops had established a post in the valley in an area that was considered to be within India's territory, India responded by increasing troop presence through what is called Operation Falcon, that heightened tensions. And there seemed to be imminent war, but intense diplomatic negotiations took place, with both sides agreeing to de-escalate. That led to a very positive development, because in 1988, the then Prime Minister, Rajiv Gandhi, visited China. That, in many senses, proved to be the turning point in relations between the two countries and resulted in many subsequent agreements that brought in a modicum of peace and tranquility on the border. And let me describe those four major agreements that laid down, in many senses, the protocols on how the border was to be managed and what would be the procedure for a final agreement on the border dispute. Now, the first agreement is the most critical one, which happened in 1993, which is called the Agreement on Peace and Tranquility. that laid down the need for peaceful coexistence for the two countries. That is 1980 and 1993, that's almost 30 years ago. And this included border control mechanisms that aimed to prevent escalation through constant military communications. The second agreement that came soon after, it was called the Border Peace and Tranquility Agreement in 1996, 3 years later, that created further confidence-building measures, including troop reductions at the line of actual control and regular military meetings between the two sides. Now, the third agreement showed that the process had moved forward, and this was in 2005, and this was called the Agreement on Political Parameters and Guiding Principles that was to provide a roadmap for the border settlement through mutual recognition and respect. Now, that was a significant development because earlier we were just looking at keeping the border tranquil and peaceful, and now for the first time we were actually talking of trying to settle the borders. This was a big development, but that began to slow up. There was a fourth agreement which was signed in 2013 and was called the Border Defense Cooperation Agreement that focused on avoiding military conflict by settling clear protocols for troop encounters. Now, after Xi Jinping took over as China's president in 2013, initially it looked like he was pushing for improving ties between India and China, but there were several border incidents that occurred before the big Galwan clash in 2020 under his reign. Now, the first clash happened, in fact, in 2013, when after Xi came to power at what is called the Daulat Beg Oldi sector or DBO sector of Ladakh, where around 50 soldiers, Chinese soldiers, established a camp 19 kilometers inside India's territory. Now, this was apparently in response to India's increasing infrastructure development in the region, particularly the crucial, what is called the Darbuk-Shylock DBO road that linked it to an airstrip reactivated by India to fortify its control in the region. After 3 weeks of standoff and diplomatic negotiations, both sides agreed to pull back, with China dismantling its temporary camps, and India, of course, continued its infrastructure development over there, solidifying its positions along that particular DBO route that we had discussed, and improving its logistics in the high-altitude region. Now, the next big standoff was in September 2014, 1 year later, in the Chumar region in Ladakh. This, even as Chinese President Xi Jinping was on his visit to India and was having a bilateral summit with Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who, if you recall, had just taken over as Prime Minister a couple of months earlier. Now, here the Chinese troops attempted to construct a road into Indian territory, which then provoked Indian forces to intervene. And after diplomatic talks during Xi Jinping's visit, both sides agreed to withdraw. The next big incident happened in 2017 at the Doklam Plateau, which, if you look at the map, is the tri-junction area between India, China, and Bhutan. And the Doklam Plateau, claimed by both China and Bhutan, lies strategically close to India's Siliguri corridor. Now, this corridor is that narrow chicken's neck that connects mainland India to its crucial northeastern states. And in June 2017, Chinese troops began constructing a road through Doklam, which Bhutan objected to, and Indian forces intervened to halt construction, leading to a really tense standoff for something like 73 days. And that standoff ended with a mutual disengagement, with both sides agreeing to withdraw their troops from the area. Now, China ceased road construction, but maintained a presence near the plateau, and is subsequently said to have fortified its infrastructure in Doklam. Then, in September 2019, remember Galwan is June 2020, there was another clash in what is called Pangyong So Lake in Ladakh. The lake has finger-like ridges that has long been disputed and has led to frequent patrolling friction between the two countries. On this occasion, at what is known as Finger Four, a clash erupted between India and Chinese troops, with soldiers engaged in a scuffle, but had no lethal weapons, because that was the agreement in 1993 and 1996, that they would not carry lethal weapons that could harm each other. So there was a scuffle, and then both sides pulled back after a few hours. But the incident really underscored the sensitivity of the lake, the Pangyong-seo lake, and foreshadowed in what would become the major 2020 clash. India, of course, subsequently increased its presence in the area to secure its position to Finger Four. Now, that then brings us to the big clash, which is where all the various steps towards normalcy and everything else began to fall considerably. And this was when relations reached its nadir, and that was in June 2020. In the thick of COVID, Chinese mounted a sustained aggression at the Galwan Valley in eastern Ladakh. It marked the most violent encounter between India and China in over 50 years and resulted in casualties on both sides, the first time since 1975. Now, the Galwan Valley is a strategically located valley near the DBO Road conjunction, which I mentioned earlier. India's infrastructure development in that region was seen by China as a strategic threat to its control over Aksai Chin and access to Tibet and Xinjiang. That's the explanation experts give as to why China attacked at that particular point. And the clash occurred during a de-escalation process resulting in 20 Indian casualties and an unspecified number of Chinese fatalities during that time. As I mentioned, it's the first time since 1975 that there was loss of lives of the kind that we saw in Galwan. The clash led to a rapid militarization in Ladakh, with both nations, China and India, deploying thousands of troops, which we hadn't seen before, and heavy artillery across the LAC. Now, here again, there were 5 points, other points where, apart from Galwan, where the Chinese changed the status quo. One of them was much older, but I'll come to that. Now, in the second point was at the Fingers area in Pangyong Tso. China moved from Finger 8 to Finger 4, which India traditionally patrolled, and prevented Indian troops from accessing it during this period. The third flashpoint, and all this is happening simultaneously in a couple of months, was the Gogra post at Patrol Point 17A, east of the Ashok River in Ladakh. Chinese had built up troops and bunkers, which India objected to. The fourth area was called the Patrol Point 15 at Hot Springs, also in Ladakh, that witnessed a similar buildup. And the fifth area was the Depsang Plains. It's a strategically significant area near northern Ladakh, very close to the DBO airstrip and close to the Karakoram Pass, which is critical for China. Indians were prevented from accessing certain patrol points, which they'd accessed earlier. The sixth was an older friction point at Demchok, located near Indus River, where China had begun to object to India's infrastructure development over there. And as that place has seen frequent patrolling disputes in the past couple of years. Now, the Galwan clashes affected India-China relations, leading to a boycott of Chinese goods. Of course, that boycott happened a little earlier, but that intensified. And of course, it heightened India's security concerns across the border. The incident also triggered intense diplomatic and military negotiations, including regular co-commander talks to ease tensions and bring about gradual disengagement. And in the past 4 years, we have seen India and China working mechanism for consultation and coordination. They held as many as 21 rounds of co-commander level talks and 31 rounds of talks with the Ministry of External Affairs of both these sides. Now, these talks resulted in disengagements that occurred at 4 major spots, which are the Hot Springs, Galwan, Gogra, and Pangyong Tso, where buffer zones were created. Now, so therefore, External Affairs Mr. Jaishankar said a couple of months ago that 75% of the dispute that happened in 2020 had been sorted out. 4 big friction points had been worked out. Of course, experts debate as to whether that's really, what is the nature of that particular disengagement, how much has really been achieved. That's still something that is being talked about. But the recent agreement between India and China to resume patrolling Depsang and Demchok, which are the remaining 2 disputed areas, is seen as a big breakthrough to end the standoff, but is viewed with caution. Now, having understood the significance of these issues, let us now bring in Ambassador Ashok Kantha to analyze how we look at this possible detente and what are the promises and perils ahead for us. So, Ashok, thank you for joining us on Nothing But the Truth. And let's get down to brass tacks, as they say.
Thank you, Raj. Yeah.
What is your take on the current so-called agreement or detente that seems to have developed in Kazan? How significant is that, and what is the promise we hold before we get to the pitfalls?
Well, what has been achieved is significant, no doubt. As you mentioned earlier, there is beginning of a thaw in India-China relations. The very fact that Prime Minister Modi and President Xi had their first structured bilateral conversation after nearly 5 years. That shows that there was hiatus in the relationship in a way that will continue for some time. What we have witnessed on the 21st October, we announced disengagement of troops. Later, it was clarified that we are talking about the disengagement limited to Depsang Plains and Demchok only in eastern Ladakh.
Right.
The fine print is still awaited, so we don't know what's the nature of disengagement. Whether our troops will be able to access patrolling points they're visiting until April, May 2020 in Depsang Plains and in Demchok. Foreign Secretary has clarified that we are not reopening understandings reached earlier
Right.
with regard to other so-called friction points. That is, Galwan Valley, Hot Spring, Gogra, and Pangkung Lake area.
Right. Right.
Now, the benchmark for normalcy was set by our Minister of External Affairs, Dr. Jaishankar, on many occasions. He had very categorically and very rightly mentioned that the state of borders will determine state of relations, and that we need the restoration of peace and tranquility in border areas before we can return to the normal track in overall relations. Whether we fulfill that benchmark is still a little uncertain.
Right.
We saw comments made by Army Chief on 22nd October in a public lecture that we would like to see restoration to status quo as of April 2022. Now, in April 22, we did not have buffer zones, which were created subsequently in so-called buffer zones, so-called friction points, 4 friction points. We'll have to see when we resume patrolling to patrolling points our troops were visiting earlier until early 2020. When our graziers get access to our pastures. So this is one set of issues. I believe, much more work remains to be done. Secondly, Dr. Jaishankar had rightly mentioned on 12th September, you have the issue of disengagement, where progress has been made, no doubt about it. To my mind, more ground needs to be covered. But he had mentioned that the bigger issue was militarization of border. The fact that, in April 2022, Chinese side brought in a very large number of troops. Initially, we thought that was for a routine exercise. Later, it turned out they pivoted and transgressed line of actual control. We had counter-deployment from our side. I think that situation persists. There is still abnormalcy along border areas, and Army Chief made it very clear that disengagement, de-escalation, and the normal management of line of actual control will depend on how mutual trust is restored. That's going to be a difficult process. De-escalation from these theaters and eventually de-induction. So that remains to be done. At the same time, important progress is that we have started re-engaging with China. If you look at readout from both sides, the special representatives will meeting. They have not met since November 2019. Foreign ministers will also have structured meetings, and we will address these issues. But as you mentioned, there are discrepancies in readouts coming from Chinese side and Indian side. In fact, the Chinese side doesn't even refer to an agreement on disengagement. It only talks of progress being made, whereas we have been talking about complete disengagement. So I think some of these discrepancies will need to be addressed. And the final point I would like to make that the linkage between borders returning to normalcy and overall relations returning to normalcy, I think that still needs to be maintained. Our
Right.
borders are not yet normal, so we should make haste slowly about returning to business as usual in our relations with China.
That's a excellent phrase. Make haste slowly till things return to normal as we see it, to continue business. But Ashok, one of the things we need to look at is the timing of this. We did have, as you mentioned earlier, 4 friction points being cleared of, at least in terms of patrolling, and an agreement of buffer zones that has happened, not in terms of patrolling, buffer zones that had been established. Now, how do you look at this particular agreement or statements that are out here? What prompted China to move this way? Move much more forward than what they had ever agreed before in the last couple of years, and what prompted Delhi or India to engage with them in this manner and look at it as something of a major breakthrough, possibly, if things proceed as they say they would.
Raj, one can try and understand motives on Chinese side only when there's clarity
Right.
on what exactly has been agreed upon, what kind of concessions they made. There is greater flexibility, no doubt about it.
I was
Because,
looking at the timing.
yeah,
If you
uh,
give, what is your sense of the timing? Why now? You could have
well,
done
this
it
is
2 years
something.
earlier. You could have,
No, this was something which was discussed for quite some time.
right,
Initially, they're not prepared to discuss disengagement in Depsang and Demchek at all.
right,
So they have come around to not really discussing, but agreeing on some kind of package for disengagement. Not timing, one can speculate only that Chinese are also under a lot of pressure.
right,
They're facing geopolitical pushback. They're going through economic difficulties. You would have noticed that there is a degree of tactical flexibility being displayed by China in its dealings with major countries, including the USA, EU, UK, Australia, Vietnam, and now India. So this is tactical to my mind. I don't
mhm,
see any change in China's larger strategic objectives or its posture vis-a-vis India. But to the extent it provides openings to us, we should explore it. Without lowering our guard, without having any sort of uh, exaggerated expectations about a quick transition to normalcy in relations or reset in overall ties. I think we have to be very cautious. And you would have noticed that special representatives have been tasked not only to discuss the issue of resolution of boundary question, which is their primary mandate, but also go into issues relating to maintenance of peace and tranquility
right.
in border areas. So we expect that certain matters that remain unresolved, including with regard to so-called buffer zones, they are sorted out. And at the least, troops get access back to patrolling points they're visiting until early 2020, and our graziers can return to their pasture lands they were traditionally using.
Now, Ashok, if you look back, now the whole process with President Xi was that in the beginning there was a bit of a clash. Then, when Prime Minister Modi came in, we saw that he had come in at 2014 for a meeting in Ahmedabad, his first bilateral summit with Prime Minister Modi. Then we had, of course, Prime Minister Modi going across to China for his summit meeting, almost back to back the next year. And of course, we had the talks in Wuhan, the informal talks in 2018, and in Mamallapuram in 2019. So the two sides had engaged with each other considerably. There's something like, apart from these 4 big meetings, there were these 18 meetings, a total of 18 meetings between the two leaders. And yet we saw what happened in Galwan. Despite the fact that we seem to be moving closer and trying to understand each other, Galwan happened. And so let's look at why, what is the reason Galwan happened?
Well, Raj, first, I think your characterization is on the spot that we had a period, I was ambassador during that time when Prime Minister Modi especially visited Ahmedabad to receive President Xi Jinping.
Right.
And 2014, September 2014, May 2015, President Xi traveled to Xi'an, his hometown, to receive Prime Minister Modi. Both were unprecedented gestures.
Right.
And it was a period of hope, of possibilities. But even at that time, we started warning that while there's greater bonhomie in ties, relations between two leaders, and things are happening in certain areas. Structural problems in the relationship were accumulating. You referred to what happened in Depsang Plains in 2013, what happened in Chumar and Demchok in 2014, what happened in Doklam in 2017. So border problem was festering. No progress on resolution of boundary question, no progress on clarification line of actual control. So that was one set of issues, but there were other issues, including growing mistrust between two sides about each other's strategic intentions. Chinese were concerned about our relations with USA. We were very uncomfortable about what they're doing in our neighborhood, in South Asia, in Indian Ocean region. Trade and economic relations had become skewed and becoming more and more so. So I think we were not very comfortable about what was happening in the relationship, despite the fact that there were 18 meetings between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi between 2014 and November 2019. Yet, what happened in summer of 2020 came as a surprise because, earlier standoff situations were different. I was involved with negotiating resolution of standoff situation in Demchok and Chumar in September 2014. And mandate brief given to me by very simple. Ask them to restore status quo ante as of 1st September 2014. And we achieved that. We didn't discuss anything else. This time, situation was very different. One, they seemed to be undertaking a routine military exercise, but they pivoted, taking advantage of distraction caused by the COVID pandemic and transgressed the line of actual control at multiple locations and very seriously disturbed the status quo. And they refused to return. They refused to restore status quo ante. And as you know, we also took a strong position. We also had counter deployment from our side. So borders changed completely. The nature of border became live, unstable, and sensitive. And we made it clear that as long as borders are abnormal, we cannot have normalcy in relations. And that has been a very clear understanding right since 1988, that while we'll not let outstanding boundary question come in the way of movement in relations, it's predicated on this assumption that both sides will respect status quo along the borders, not try to change the line of actual control. And there's formal understanding reached in 1993 and 4 subsequent agreements.
Correct.
All those understandings were violated. So we entered a new territory. Why Chinese did that? My own feeling is that I think Chinese, hunger for territory. They have their own historical claims, not anchored in evidence or facts, and they are trying to realize those claims unilaterally. You look at the behavior in South China Sea, East China Sea, Taiwan Strait, India-China borders. They try to change facts to the ground along in India-China Relations in Eastern Ladakh. We responded strongly, but the fact remains that they did manage to alter the status quo in a significant manner. So we need to undo that. That's why it becomes very important that we don't accept piecemeal solution because we are talking about the territory of India here. It's nothing less than that.
If you look at so the development, as I was mentioning earlier, you did have two informal summits that were there, which seemed like we were getting on the same page on various issues, and yet, as I mentioned, China does what it does. Now, let us examine the proposition that they are trying to push. Okay, well, fair enough. India, over a period of time, since in the last 10 years or so, or 15 years, has built the infrastructure that does counter China in various areas that earlier we had not done so. So we did have a buildup of sorts over there to counter any China, funny businesses that they might try at some point. But again, here it remains a puzzle that after having developed so much of, and as you said, 18 meetings between the two, that Xi will turn his back and literally stab India by these intrusions that happen. Is it, and here you can't say like in 2014, he was, the Chinese PLA was doing something that he didn't really approve of, and that was what was put out at that time. Again, it remains. So if you analyze Xi Jinping now, and I'm trying to bring it to make it very contemporary, what is changing in China that makes Xi Jinping now move towards a detente, a rapprochement? And what changed in 2019, where he said, 2020, where he said, it doesn't matter. We can just push aside all these 20 years of work that happened, or 30 years, and we'll do what we want to do.
First, Raj, I don't think we should jump to the conclusion that we are on the threshold of a détente or rapprochement with China, because then we'll be underestimating problems we have, both in terms of restoration normalcy in border areas, including Eastern Ladakh, and broader, structural problems we have with that country. Those problems haven't gone away. So it's going to be an uphill task rebuilding relationship that two leaders are referred to during the meeting in Kazan. I'll be hopeful, but I'll be very realistic and cautious also at the same time. Now, why Chinese decided? I mentioned that. I mean, partly it's the way they look at territory. Sovereignty has become a major preoccupation for the party state in China. When party state looks at a legitimacy, earlier it looked at the performance legitimacy, high growth rate, etc. Now, if you look at pronouncements of Xi Jinping, he talks about sacred territory of China, not losing an inch of territory. He talks about the language of securitization of society, where stability and security have become predominant considerations, even more important than development and economic growth. So it's a different China, the way it's dealing with the rest of the world, including India. And that is not going to change. That's what I'm mentioned earlier, that what we are seeing is more tactical flexibility being displayed by China, unless there's more evidence to arrive at a different conclusion. And I don't see that evidence at this point of time. Now, what Chinese are trying to do, if they can sort of improve relations with India, get more access to Indian market, don't forget the fact that Chinese economy is not doing well, and domestic drivers of Chinese economy are not gaining strength.
Right.
In fact, domestic demand remains very weak. So increasingly, they're looking at export-led, investment-led model, even though they had earlier come to the conclusion that that approach is not viable. For them, India is an important market. Last year, if you go by International Trade Center data, Their surplus with India was $106 billion.
Right.
And our exports to China were only $16 billion. We restricted the FDI inflows from China, beginning Press Note 3 of 17th April 2020, which incidentally happened before border tensions
Right.
escalated. So they would like those things to be changed. Discussions we have had recently at track 2 and track 1.5 level with Chinese counter colleagues. They are raising demands like giving level playing field to Chinese companies, are being more flexible in terms of issuance of visas, allowing Chinese journalists to come back to India. So these or resumption of direct flights between India and China. So they would like to see these things happening because these things are impacting uh, business ties, economic relations between India and China. Whereas we pointed out that these problems are really symptoms of a larger malaise, which is what they did in border areas and sort of contradictions which have developed in India-China relations. So it will be, to my mind, long haul. It's not something which is going to be resolved soon, and we should be quite realistic about it. Even while we should keep exploring openings and possibilities.
Now, I think that the word of caution is good, and the talk of it being a long haul, and don't expect immediate results. Because, as you rightly said, if you look at the trade imbalances, it's enormous. Though, very interestingly, and that's why this timing becomes also very important. If you know, our economic survey this year did talk about the fact that we should be willing to open up to China in terms of our investments. There was talk of a lot of industry being dependent on Chinese, inputs that were there, which made the cost of production much cheaper, and therefore our exports were beginning to suffer if we didn't do that. So there was a lot of arguments being built up in that survey, and not just beyond that survey, among a lot of business houses, that it is time that India began to get Chinese investments in, or at least settle some of the issues in critical areas so that our businesses are not impacted. So do you see a kind of a somewhat of, let's say, an orchestration of issues? I mean, that the build-up is there, and economics is one of the issues that also propelled some sort of agreement.
I agree with you that this growing chorus, if I can use the term, that
Right.
we should have a more normal business engagement with China. A consideration on our side. Now, what I like to point out that we did stop business engagement with China. Business engagement continued. The very fact that we have trade deficit of $106 billion last year shows that our imports have kept growing from China. We are getting components and subcomponents. In fact, the level of dependencies on China for critical imports has become very unhealthy. You have areas like active pharmaceutical ingredients. 85% of our requirements come from China. Likewise, electronics or green energy equipment. Uh, Situation today is not desirable at all. I think we need to move towards reduced dependencies on China. And a lot of other countries are doing that. We are not alone. China has become, I think, too central a player in global value chain. And post-COVID, post-Ukraine conflict, there is realization that we must have more resilient global value chains. Now, how do we do that? We have, as you're aware, we have production-linked incentive schemes in 14 sectors. And I think de-risking vis-a-vis China is an important objective behind that. We are diversifying our imports, but it's a very difficult process. Whether getting foreign direct investment from China will be a large part of solution, I have my grave doubts. We welcomed investment from China, especially after Prime Minister's visit to China in May 2015 when he had a meeting with the top business leaders, and he told them that we welcome investment, and he tasked us to follow up, which we did, and I'm sure my successors also did. But the end result was rather mixed. Until April 2020, we were wooing investment from China.
Mhm.
Our total investment flow was just about $2.5 billion. And they were coming in areas which were rather sensitive point of view,
Mhm.
data rich areas, telecom, or areas like cellular handsets, where with relatively small investment, they got a 75% market share in India. So I think there was already, rethinking on that issue. Looking ahead, uh, my feeling is that Press Note 3 should stay. We should get investment from China, but it should be done selectively in areas where the investments can help with building up of our manufacturing capability, making India a larger part, a bigger node in global value chain. One last point I would like to
Yes.
make, that there is a major transformation taking place in global value chain.
Mm.
You're aware of, especially in high-tech areas,
Right.
policies of de-risking being pursued by USA, by China itself, by EU and other countries. So they are getting too closely integrated with Chinese supply chains, will in fact reduce our attractiveness when this diversification away from
Right.
China takes place as part of development of a more resilient global value chain. We have to bear those facts, and we have to bear in mind that Chinese are very restrictive about any transfer of technology, and that today in China, it's geopolitics and security in command. And it's a state-led development strategy Xi Jinping has doubled down upon. We shouldn't lose sight of those basic trends while enhancing our economic engagement with China.
And just a couple of final points, Ashok, taken a lot of your time. Uh, One of the things that is being talked about is this very, you called it a chorus, some sort of a, a consonance, let's put it, that happens. You had the Foreign Affairs Minister, or External Affairs Minister Jaishankar go across to Pakistan for the SCO meet, which was the first time in, say, 9 years or so that External Affairs Minister went to Pakistan, given our relations with them. And there was, the rhetoric had been completely rolled down, I mean, reduced when it, came to Kashmir and other issues, terror. There was mention of all these, but not in the manner that used to happen in the past couple of years. One. Then you saw what happened in Kazan, where there was the signs of a thaw with China and the Russia angle in it, in the sense Putin and our friendship with President Putin over there. Is there? Do you see some sort of pattern in this? Because on the other side there is great uncertainty of the outcome of the U.S. elections, and whether the disruptive nature of Donald Trump coming back, or the continuum that Kamala Harris will probably represent. We don't know that. But certainly everyone's hedging their bets. And is this one of the directions, this pattern? Can we discern some sort of pattern in this? Or are we
Uh,
reading too much?
no, I think what you're mentioning, Raj, makes a lot of sense. We are in a period of strategic churn when there are, whole lot of uncertainty about what will happen. You referred to U.S. presidential elections. Uh, Outcome is unknown at this point of time. If you have someone like Donald Trump coming back to White House, no one really knows what kind of policies he'll pursue. Uh, there are certain anxieties in our own relations with the USA, for instance. I will not say they are fundamental or deep-rooted, but there is degree of discomfort. Most importantly, I think when we talk about strategic autonomy, we would like to have more elbow room to deal with various countries, both in our neighborhood and major powers. So that's a sensible approach to adopt. Uh, we should keep exploring. That's why I mentioned we should keep exploring possibilities of India-China relations returning to a more healthy footing. But we should not have any illusions that that's going to be a very challenging proposition, and that for foreseeable future, China will be our primary strategic challenge. And we'll have to deal with it accordingly, which will require our continuing to maintain, our caution and deterrence along the borders. In fact, reinforcing our deterrence, trying to reduce capability gap with China, which has become very large, and also maintaining the policy of external balancing vis-a-vis China without having any sort of exaggerated expectations in that regard. Finally, it will depend on our own capabilities. Our deterrence will be derived from our economic and military capabilities and our infrastructure on the ground along India-China borders.
Just one last point is that, you've been an experienced hand in terms of probably one of the best hands we have on China, understanding China. And you've also served under the Xi regime partly. What are the big lessons? Here we've dealt with Xi in various forms as a friend, as suddenly turned a foe in terms of the border. We've seen the ups and downs that have happened under his reign. How should we deal with Xi? What are the big lessons we've learned from this?
I think most important lesson is that don't get caught by surprise, because in some way what happened in Eastern Ladakh amounted to not reading Chinese intentions properly, especially in terms of the military deployment and what they did thereafter opposite Eastern Ladakh. So we have to be very cautious. We need to keep improving our ISR capabilities, but that's on the nuts and bolts side. Larger issue is to correctly assess the nature of China challenge. And this challenge is based on the fact that Chinese military and economic capabilities have increased exponentially, and their intentions have likewise, ambitions have likewise changed dramatically. China is seeking a unipolar Asia, even though, in Chinese readout, there's a reference to multipolar world. You would have noticed we referred to multipolar Asia and multipolar world. Chinese readout referred only to multipolar world. They would like to dominate Asia. They would like to sort of displace USA as a preeminent power in this part of the world, if not globally eventually. And that has been stated very categorically by Xi Jinping, including in his work report at 20th Party Congress in October 2022. He didn't talk about USA, but he did talk about, in terms of comprehensive national strength and influence, China becoming the most important country by middle of the century. That is Xi Jinping's China dream is all about. We should bear that in mind. I'm not saying that we should not seek constructive engagement with China. Must do that. It's the largest neighbor. But we should do so without conceding, Chinese, expectation that there'll be hierarchy in Asia or Indo-Pacific. It's not part of India's DNA to accept any such subsidiary role. So how to manage simultaneous rise of China, which is more conspicuous, but some also rise of India, which may be less, conspicuous, yet equally important. I think that challenge will stay with us for quite some time.
Ambassador Ashok Kantha, I mean, you put it so well in terms of not only cautioning us and not getting overexcited as what is happening, not be using loose terms in terms of describing it as a breakthrough, a detente, or rapprochement, but to actually take it step by step, watch what they're doing. Meanwhile, learn how to manage China, with our eyes open, having learned our lessons from the past where we did misread some signs. But thank you very much. You've thrown
Thank
a
you.
lot of
Thank you,
light
Raj.
for it.
Thanks for inviting
Thank you.
me. Really good to have this conversation with you.
Thank you, Ashok, and goodbye. Nothing but the truth.